Izwan Safri says, hello from Malaysia. As a former sustainability practitioner, I really dig your analysis. Thank you, sir. Now, if only Taiwan, Japan, the Philippines and their likes in the East had the foresight to abandon the US now, it would surely make the world a better and more peaceful place, even perhaps more prosperous. Imagine a world where the Middle East could just get on with their lives, with Africa finally getting to live to their potential, and who knows, perhaps India and Pakistan just getting along. Wouldn't that be something nice? Peace. Well, yes, you have a beautiful picture that you paint, sir, but unfortunately we have to understand that Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Taiwan, all these nations are in no position to abandon the US. The US won't let that happen. The US has more than 130 permanent military bases on Japanese territory. Japan is under permanent US military occupation. So is South Korea. Taiwan is a US-owned island, and so on and so forth. So these countries, unfortunately, for them, are in no position to abandon the US. It just won't happen. So that is the situation. It would be wonderful if Africa could finally start living up to its potential. But once again, we have to understand that Africa is still colonized. We just don't realize it. Their economies are controlled by Western nations. They have dictators that have been installed there by Western nations, and that's just how the nations are. The nations in Africa are controlled. When it comes to India and Pakistan, that's an issue that will be resolved in the next 5 to 10 years. Pakistan is a temporary nation. It's an unfinished piece of history as far as we in India are concerned. So hopefully that gets resolved peacefully. That's the thing. So it would really be great if the world could finally be a peaceful place. But if you look at the past 10,000 years of history, sadly, that's not how the world works. Sadly, the history of the human species is a history of warfare. All geopolitical changes and advancements primarily happen through warfare. So one can hope for more peace and for a longer term of peace, but as long as certain powers are in control of the world and they control the so-called rules-based world order or whatever, the world will not have peace. So we, I guess, unfortunately have to reconcile ourselves to a world that is never going to be fully at peace, but one can hope for more peace, and one can hope for Africa to be finally free, and these nations that you referred to, Japan, the Philippines, South Korea, Taiwan, etc., finally being free of external interference. Let's talk about happiness. Alex Klein says, these happiness stats and freedom stats used by European countries are always skewed with bias. I had Australians tell me as an American, they had more freedom during COVID just because an article told them that they did. It's all propaganda. Well, yes, you are right. There's a lot of propaganda when it comes to all these indices, freedom index, hunger index, happiness index, God knows what else index. The question is, how are these indices created? Let's take the example of the happiness index. How do you quantify happiness? Am I happy here? Look at me. But I'm in India, and India is supposed to be one of the most unhappy nations in the planet. So the question is, how do you quantify happiness? There is no real way of quantifying happiness. But yeah, you could do a survey. You can ask a bunch of people, how happy are you on a scale of from 1 to 10? Then the question is, what's the sample size? And then, is the sample truly representative of the entire population of a nation? So if you take a sample size of 100, it's not going to represent the entire nation. If you take a sample size of 1,000 out of a country of 1.4 billion, it's not going to represent the entire country. Then if you take the sample population from the metropolitan cities only, you're going to get a very skewed perspective. The question is, what sort of people were surveyed and how many people were surveyed and where were they located? This information is not revealed to us. So typically the sample size that they give us is about 1,000 people that they survey, and based on that they tell you that a country is happy or not. This is nonsense. That's not how it's done. And once again, the other point that has to be raised is that many of these nations that rank so high on the happiness index, many of these nations have extremely high suicide rates. So how do you correlate these two? How do you reconcile these two pieces of information? So the fact is that much of this is propaganda. They seek to put certain countries into certain categories. So India, for example, is now viewed as a threat by the West. India is a nation that is now finally rising to its potential. It's beginning to rise to its potential. And the West is not happy about this. They want India to stay in its lane. They want the Indians to stay on the reservation, don't get off the reservation. And that's why they are doing all this, to create a certain kind of impression about India. When it comes to Australia, we know how draconian the COVID restrictions were. It was like people being imprisoned in their own home. And yet, this nation is supposed to be way happier than India. Look at Canada. Canada is a borderline fascist nation now because of the policies of the Justin Trudeau regime. So let's be factual here. Let's be realistic. All these indices are merely propaganda. I can come up with my own index, right? And I've got a big following, not a small following. And let's make that the Chavda index of democracy or whatever. Would you like me to do that? I could come up with that. So that's not how it's done. So let's understand that this is all propaganda. Let's not take these indices seriously. They represent propaganda put out by certain organizations. There is no transparency into about how these indices are created, what sort of population, what sort of data is collected, whether the data represents the population properly, whether it's cherry-picked or not. Most likely it's cherry-picked. What sort of calculations are done to come up with these numbers? We have no idea about this, and clearly it's not something we should take seriously. So my perspective is very clear. This is plain and simple propaganda. Victor Jr. says, India is being courted by the West as a tool to contain China. All Eastern strategic thinkers are well aware of the Anglo-Saxon plan. But India mustn't fall into the Western trap, because once India reaches the level as China, India will be next. Yes, good point that you raised, sir. The US has something called the Wolfowitz Doctrine. This is a doctrine that was formulated about roughly 2 decades ago during the time of George W. Bush, if I am not mistaken. So what does this doctrine state or say? This doctrine says that the US is the only superpower in the world. It's the only preeminent power in the world, and it must take active measures to prevent the emergence of any other power that could one day challenge the US. This is the essence of the Wolfowitz Doctrine. Now, the US totally messed up when it came to China's rise. They actually aided and abetted the rise of China, and now China has become a problem for the US. So, the only nation in Asia that is capable of counterbalancing China or posing a threat to China is India. So the US would like to use India to counterbalance China, and they would like to use India as a tool to offset China's threat to the US. Now, when it comes to India, I am here in Ladakh. This is the wonderful Pangong Lake. A significant portion of this lake is currently illegally occupied by China. And China has occupied Aksai Chin, they claim Arunachal Pradesh, and they constantly engage in salami slicing attempts to nibble away at Indian territory. So China is a threat for India. So it makes sense for India, from the logic of strategy, to align itself with the US in certain aspects to counterbalance China, or to offset China, or to prevent China from doing too much of this. But like you said, eventually India is currently a rising nation. India's economy is rising. It's projected to eventually become a significantly large economy, definitely the top 3 in the world. So at that point in time, it will not only become an adversary for China, but also for the US. So the US will want to use India as a tool to counterbalance China, but they do not want India to rise too much, and they are actively taking measures to prevent that from happening. So that's the situation that India is in. We need to align ourselves to a certain extent with the US to offset China, but we also know that the US doesn't want India to rise, and we have this adversary right over there, which is like that's Chinese occupied Ladakh, so they are there. So this is the situation India is in. But like you said, it's very true that once India rises significantly, India will be next in the crosshairs of Uncle Sam. So that's the situation, and that's an accurate assessment. Linda Tong says, I like your tongue-in-cheek presentation. India should learn to give the US the middle finger, but like all Asians, we are very polite, not mafias. But let's see. Biden is laying out the red carpet, done salute, etc. for Modi on his first official state visit to the US. Biden is using flattery first, failing which there can be some arm twisting. But I think whatever happens, Modi is going to place India first. Right, so Mr. Modi is about to embark on an official state visit to the United States. He's going to address a joint session of the lower house and the upper house. That's what's going to happen. And as we know right now, there is a significant amount of booing of India that's happening from the US, from the West. and they want to use essentially India as a bulwark against China. That's what is happening. So they will certainly lay out the red carpet for Mr. Modi. In the past, when it comes to Indian leaders, flattery has worked very well in the past. While with Mr. Modi, flattery doesn't work. They're going to try flattery, they're going to try the red carpet treatment. And if that doesn't work, they don't get what they want, they will certainly try some arm twisting tactics. That also is definitely going to be on the cards. That's not something that you see in the open, that happens behind closed doors. That's what really diplomacy is about. It's about threats, it's about arm twisting and all that. So all of that is going to be on the cards during this state visit. And like you say, Linda, Mr. Modi is going to put India first. He's playing a very astute game of geopolitical balancing of the various great powers. On the one hand you have China, on the other hand you have Russia, then you have the US. So that's the game that's being played right now, and certainly we're gonna see this happen. Flattery, red carpet treatment, some amount of arm twisting possibly behind the scenes. We will not come to know about it, but we can rest assured that Mr. Modi will keep India first. So I agree with your assessment. Tony says, my government, the USA, has already stated in absolute terms that they never expected Ukraine to win. We have the stolen documents to prove this. My government expects Ukrainians to die fighting Russians on their behalf. Well, I agree with you, and that's exactly what the situation is. It's very clear what the American long-term strategy is, what their objective is. They want to destroy Russia, they want to dismantle Russia, they want to make Russia... They want to end the Russian threat that they perceive. And Ukraine is merely a proxy in this war. So Ukraine is a disposable asset for the Americans. Ukraine, we don't know what the situation is going to be like in the coming months. Right now, the Russians are in control of roughly a quarter of Ukraine, the Donbas region. They have taken Bakhmut after a lot of fighting of 224 days. And lots of Ukrainians have died in the Bakhmut meat grinder, Ukrainian soldiers. And we don't know how it's going to go. The Russians could eventually, possibly, take over the whole of Ukraine. And it's not such a big loss for the US. Ukraine is a disposable asset. The entirety of Western Europe is a buffer zone for the Americans. That's what they created after the end of the Second World War. They converted the whole of Western Europe into a buffer zone against the USSR. After the disintegration of the USSR, Russia was very weak. But after Mr. Putin came to power, Russia started rising again. And now, this is the battle. The Americans want to end the Russian threat, eventually, hopefully, perhaps from their perspective, once and for all. And Ukraine is a disposable asset in this pursuit. So I agree with you.